Well, welcome back to Root Source, and we're interviewing Lesley Richardson. Now, is it Lesley Ann Richardson? For some reason that comes. Maybe it's on a book or something. But before we get to that, tell us, and I'd love to ask this question. You know, you live in Jerusalem, wonderful, in a beautiful neighborhood. How did that happen?
Long story and a very exciting story. Well, back in the 80s, I had a very strong Christian faith, but I knew very little about Israel. I'm from Australia. And one day, a book came into my hands, and the book was called O Jerusalem, and it was written by some journalists called Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre, very well-known writers. And what they did in this book was describe the history of what took place in this land in 1948. And the book had an electrifying effect on me because I was learning about the history of the Jewish people, and I was beginning to understand what they'd gone through and their incredible courage. And I could see the hand of God in this, what was happening in Israel. And the more I read the scriptures, the more I began to understand the Hebrew scriptures, yes, but also the New Testament, such Jewish books. And so that was opening up to me. But at the same time, I had this passionate desire to come to Israel and to live here and to work here. And I can look back and say, I understand this is the call of God on my life. And he's laid me on a very exciting journey, and the Lord has opened some wonderful doors for me, and I'm very, very grateful. I've lived here for many years, and I'm very...
So how were you able to make Aliyah?
No, I haven't made Aliyah.
I mean to immigrate.
Well, I have come up to Jerusalem, as Aliyah means,
yeah, true.
Of course. And I came in the 80s, and I was here a very short time, and I was offered a job at the Anglican school. I was a teacher. And I ended up working there for 3 years. And then I went back to Australia for a year. But then I came back. I worked for Middle East television for a couple of years. Very exciting. And I worked for the International Christian Embassy for several years. I worked with the Feast of Tabernacles. And they were wonderful, exciting years. We did have the first Gulf War during those years.
All right.
And we had our gas masks and our sealed rooms, and we all prayed. No one knew what would happen, but none of us, not one person there at the embassy, left Israel, because we understand we've come to support Israel and to stand with Israel.
Right.
And then I went back to Australia in the mid-90s. It was made very plain to me that I should return to Australia. And which was a little bit difficult because I felt I would always be here. But I understand it was a very wise thing to go back to. I did more study, and I had a lot of time with my family in Australia, which is very precious. But then in 2008, I returned unexpectedly, and it was in January, and I went to Christchurch, which is where I...
In the old city?
In Jaffa Gate, inside a very beautiful, the oldest Protestant church in the Middle East. And many people who visit Israel go there and will know it. So I went to Christchurch, and there at the door, the usher, David Pileggi, who's the rector of Christchurch, introduced Dave Richardson from Canada, meet Lesley from Australia. So I met Dave. And 1 year later, we were married in Christchurch.
Did you talked about how you thought you would always be here. When did that happen to you that you felt was it a connection of the soul, of the spirit? How do you describe that?
I think this is something very deep that God is doing in the hearts of many, many Christians at this time. I feel this love that many Christians have for Israel is a new move of God's Spirit. I would, over the past decades, you could maybe date it from the 67, from the war, But God's Spirit is doing a new work in the hearts of Christians and is awakening this passionate love for Israel, this understanding that we need to reach out after the terrible centuries where we've been so far apart. And we owe the Jewish people a tremendous debt of gratitude. Everything that we have, our scriptures and our Messiah have come from
Yes.
the Jewish people.
Yes.
And I believe that the Jewish people are here in the land. They are facing tremendous challenges, and they are longing for our support and our acknowledgement of our debt to them. And I believe many are longing to build up relationships with Christians. So I feel that what's happening in my life is the Lord is doing in many, many lives.
And I think, many of our viewers will feel the same way, that there's some calls, sometimes you can't put words to it. Yeah. It's just, but it starts by coming. You've got to come once to find some better expression. I think often when we come, then we begin to understand what it's about.
Yes, I do believe that you can't come to Israel and go away changed.
And go away not changed.
Go away not changed, thank you.
Right, I agree. Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to talk about your writing. Have you always been a writer?
I've always loved writing. These are my first books, but I've longed to have the opportunity for a long time. And I feel like it's a matter of finding the place where I belong, and that is, when I was in Australia, I studied theology, and that also became a passion.
Okay.
And I began to understand I could combine those passions of theology and the land of Israel. But I think when I wrote my book about David, that also honed my writing skills as well.
Your writing is, and I think we're going to get into this in the next segment, is deep. You've studied theology. It's deep, but it's also accessible, and that is so very hard to do. It's a gift, and this book, when you open it and begin to read it, it's like the words begin to flow off the page. I have one question just before we can conclude this, and then we'll come back and talk about the book. But you said that the trigger for you to come to Israel was itself a book. You read a book, and it was an electrifying experience. Was that a sign from God that you were to perhaps be a writer?
It's true that book has had more impact on me in the sense that it changed my life than any other book but the Bible.
Yes.
But I think I've always loved writing and always wanted to write.
Yes.
Yeah, it was more that it brought me here to Israel.
And it channeled the writing's idea towards Jerusalem, and now that is what you're writing about.
Yes.
This is a clue. I wanted to ask that question because many of you, when you're touched deeply by something, it can be more than just, a channel by which you go somewhere. It can be a clue to what you'll do when you get there. I've seen it in my life. She just explained it. Yeah. I just want to highlight that for you. Notice that in your own life too.
Beautiful.
Well, thank you. One of my favorite things to do in these interviews is to find something that perhaps the interviewee hadn't noticed. So I love it when the Holy Spirit will allow that. All right. Well, we'll come back and let's get into the book next time.
Fantastic.
And until then, this is Bob Waddell for Lesley Ann Richardson saying so long for now. Shalom.
Shalom ve'litraot.